Khumalo. Yes, we are still not done with this series just yet. Now I know some of you are sick and tired of me playing with the same ID by now, but for those of you who this applies to, well, just go watch my successful demo videos instead, I guess, since I'm playing different stuff there. Even then, I must say that all the Freedom videos so far are all very different. We are exploring different cards every single time, and this one's no exception. Last time, we were looking at Zero. In fact, in the past 2 episodes, we were using it as a very efficient draw and econ engine. And what we found out was that the downside of taking net damage every turn is not the biggest issue. In fact, it can even empower us if it hits and I've had worse. So we are today going to explore a new card as promised, but this time it is not a Zero. It does force us to lose cards, but it's going to be slightly different. This is Patchwork, the new console in Anarch from Rain and Reverie. And at its fundamental level, it is basically an alternative engine card to Zero. Let's take some time now to analyze the pros, the cons, and the similarities between Zero and Patchwork, starting with what they have in common. They are both 3-influence Anarch hardware that can only be used once per turn. As an econ card, I would classify both of these as econ cards as they give you money over time. Now, duplicate copies of both Zero and Patchwork do nothing. The first copy installed will give you the engine effect that you need for the rest of the game. The second and third copy are pretty useless, aside from the fact that they can be used as fodder for Zero and Patchwork respectively. That being said, you still want to run 2 or 3 copies of each because the longer they are in play, the more benefits they will give you, so you would like to see them as early as possible. Both of these, most importantly, require you to lose cards from your hand in order for their economic effect to work. In the case of Zero, you need to suffer net damage. In the case of Patchwork, you need to trash a card from your hand. Because of this, both of these will force you to plow through your deck really quickly, and as a direct result, you should not play both in the same deck together. Otherwise, you'll find yourself milling out very, very often, potentially losing a lot of key cards into the bin well before you've gotten yourself set up. Now, let's talk about the advantages of Patchwork. Patchwork, even though it forces you to lose cards like Zero, is not random. You choose the card you trash from your hand, which is a huge advantage because that means you're not subject to random luck where you lose a key stim hack or a key breaker. Okay, not breaker. Breaker's a bad example. You know, some useful card like Employee Strike from your hand prematurely. It also grants 1 memory, unlike Zero. This means that with a single install of Patchwork, you settle your memory issues and your economy engine issues in one fell swoop, and that is a very efficient way to do things in itself. You know, for 1 install click, you settle both fundamental issues immediately. Patchwork also offers you more monetary gain over the course of the game as opposed to Zero, simply because it by reducing the play cost by 2, it essentially gives you a 2 credit discount every single turn. So yeah, kind of like Blue Moose levels of efficiency. And speaking of Blue Moose, just like Blue Moose, Patchwork is clickless. Now, this is a very subtle point that I initially did not notice, but yes, Zero requires you to spend 1 click every turn in order to get the engine rolling, whereas Patchwork is completely clickless. Like a career fair or a modded, you are activating Patchwork clicklessly as you install cards using your regular install action. As a consequence of this, Patchwork becomes incredibly efficient. It's not like a once per turn magnum opus where you click for 2 credits once every turn. It doesn't even require a click, and because of this, Patchwork is really incredible if you get it down early on. Now, it does have its downsides, which have to be discussed. First and foremost, it is expensive to install. It has the same install cost as Blue Moose at the cost of 4, and yeah, that is a big deal because nowadays against corps, going down to very low credit levels early on leaves you very vulnerable to the likes of Brian Stinson and hard-hitting news. So that is a real downside. It also takes up your console slot. Now, we mentioned this was an advantage earlier because it allows you to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, settle your memory, settle your econ engine but it also means you are not playing the other Anarch consoles, most notably Turntable, as an important tech card against, say, a Titan deck running Project Atlas counters, or Jinteki decks running Nisei Mark II. So yeah, very important to keep this in mind. Your Patchwork deck isn't running Turntable. Patchwork also does not provide card draw. Unlike Zero, this Patchwork does not help you with card draw in any way, shape or form, and as a result it also means that you have fewer good targets for Patchwork, whereas with Zero you would like to hit your Conspiracy Breakers, your duplicate copies of hardware, or also I've Had Worse. Now, hitting I've Had Worse with Zero gives you a huge tempo boost, but in stark contrast with Patchwork, you never want to use Patchwork's ability to trash an I've Had Worse from your hand. You are not going to get the I've Had Worse bonus from it. So yeah, you don't get that big tempo boost, but it also means you have fewer eligible targets for Patchwork. Also, because of this, it means that you need to run more pure card draw cards in your Patchwork deck. So cards like Street Peddler won't cut it. You need actual card draw cards to make up for the fact that Patchwork is going to reduce the number of cards in your hand very often. Now finally, Patchwork does not enable Clan Vengeance, unlike Zero, so you don't get that powerful interaction, that powerful ability to disrupt your opponent's hand. Not that big of a deal since we are Freedom Khumalo, but as we discussed in the previous Khumalo episode, having Clan Vengeance is really useful against the likes of hard-hitting used decks. So, wait, what slide is this? This wasn't meant to be here. This is meant to be here. This is the deck that we are going to use today to showcase, yeah, the new Patchwork. It's basically pretty much the same as the deck list we ran in the previous episode, the same econ engine of Consume, yeah, as our resourceless, eventless, permanent source of economy. We're also running the same old breakers, Black Orchestra, MK Ultra, Yusuf, with one SMC to get all these programs out, and a reclaim, all very standard stuff, so not much to say here. What's more important is today we are not going to play against CTM. It's going to be an interesting matchup, and I'm sure you'll be excited for this. It's going to be Mti Mwekundu. Now in this matchup, I think most of you would be compelled to hard mulligan for an employee strike because it seems like it's impossible to play against Mti Mwekundu without strike. Well, that's not necessarily the case. My opening hand has good money and has a bit of card draw and I've Had Worse, so we are going to keep it and we are going to get a good start. This, I mean, you should never compromise on the basics in your opening turns, that is to say money and card draw, just because you're looking for a hate card. Strike would be nice in my opening hand, sure. It would have allowed me to run server 1 on turn 1. Instead, my opponent does score a House of Knights, but that's fine. Now you see me brazenly running server 1 here. As I mentioned in my successful demo video, you need to be aggressive against Mti Mwekundu even if you don't have all your breakers out. Now this was a slight mistake because I should have drawn up before running. I completely forgot that Cortex Lock here would deal 4 net damage and instantly end the game for me. So just a small oversight there. Thankfully my opponent did not have the Cortex Lock to win the game with. Instead, the House of Knives triggers my I've Had Worse, allowing me to get clickless draw. This is why Anarch is so awesome against Mti Mwekundu. Now at this juncture, my opponent showed that they were reluctant to install an ice when I ran the remote with Mti Mwekundu, so I thought that running HQ and R&D would be perfectly safe here. I ran HQ to pressure that hand, and they were forced to drop a Thimble Lyric, which is an end the run code gate on HQ, hinting to me that there was at least one agenda remaining in HQ. Otherwise, they wouldn't, lose 2 credits and their end the run ice just to keep me out of HQ. So very, very good information there. Also elicits the Mti Mwekundu trigger, allowing me to run R&D for free after that. So you see I'm getting a lot of gains. I managed to destroy the remote and get a data sucker counter of R&D. We attempt this again, running R&D here, and we get hit by a Sadaka. Here I'm not that concerned about Cortex Lock because I have 3 cards in hand, one of which is an I've Had Worse, so there is a small chance I will survive Cortex Lock. They show a Sadaka instead, which I do not have a solution for. This is rather regrettable. In hindsight, I should have taken money off Liberated accounts before running R&D. So against Jinteki, I need to be more aware of the ability for the corp to trash resources with Sadaka. So if I'm playing aggressively, I need to make good use of my resources before making runs. So a bit of a play mistake there. My opponent continues expanding their House of Knives tokens, indicating to me that this is a tempo deck. Probably something like a tempo rush deck that uses net damage to slow the runner down. Again, I'm not concerned. I'm not fazed by this at all, simply because I have the extra protection in I've Had Worse as, you know, a safety net. If they do too much net damage to me, they're giving me free draw. Now I get Patchwork on the table, and this is where the economy starts going out of control. I'm going to use Patchwork immediately after installing it to play Sure Gamble. One thing to note about Patchwork is that it is not the first time you install a card each turn. It is on any install each turn, once per turn you can trigger Patchwork. So even though my first install of the turn was dropping the Patchwork on the table, I could still then use Patchwork's ability on the same turn to play Sure Gamble for 3 credits instead of 5. That caused me to drop a card. I chose to remove Divide and Conquer from my hand because the other cards in my hand were too good. A bunch of money, and I've had worse. So once again, you see me here click 1 draw just so that I can use Patchwork's ability on click 2, because I wasn't willing to use Patchwork to drop the Daily Cast, the Liberator accounts, or the I've Had Worse. So I was forced to use Patchwork to get rid of Divide and Conquer there once more. So yeah, I guess that's where Patchwork is rather awkward, because not always will you have a good target for Patchwork. Usually you want to drop Black Orchestras and NK Ultras in the bin with Patchwork, but that you know, doesn't always line up in your favor, and you're forced to ditch cards that might be useful later on, cards like Divide and Conquer. Anyway, we are going to continue exerting pressure on our opponent's side of the board, even though we haven't drawn our Employee Strike yet. We need to make sure they don't score another agenda or get a defensive upgrade going, so that Breach Dome, that's another trap, goes in the bin, and, you know, that's fine. They did not expand that Wekundu trigger yet, so that's why I was a bit hesitant to run R&D there. What I'm really looking for here is to get runs in on HQ, because I know that's where the agendas are piling up. Given that they installed the Timbolaric there earlier and have not managed to get rid of those set agendas in hand. Problem is, I only have 2 cards in my deck that break Timbolaric, and they're at the bottom of my deck, the Black Orchestras. So HQ's out for now. But we do draw into useful cards that give us incentive to run R&D. A Yusuf and a Turning Wheel. Probably not this turn, because if we install one of these cards before running, we'll be running Last Click, which is always dangerous. Instead, we are going to drop Earthrise Hotel for draw, and one of those 2 cards. I chose to drop Turning Wheel there, using Patchwork on Dirty Laundry, because it might be difficult to get successful Dirty Laundries off against Wekundu. Now, Earthrise was a very important card to install here, because I needed the passive card draw, allowing me to use Patchwork more liberally. As you see, Earthrise clicklessly draws me into MK Ultra, so now I can use Patchwork and use MK Ultra as a valid target. Here I'm going to drop Yusuf before starting to run. I'm not going to use Patchwork on Yusuf because I don't need the... It only costs 1 to install. Using Patchwork would be overkill, or rather less efficient. I'd rather use Patchwork on something that costs at least 2 to install, so getting the most bang out of my Patchwork trigger. Here I'm going to run R&D first. They will probably not use Wekundu's ability here. I was correct about that, because they wanted to save Mti's ability for the remote server 4. If they use Mti's ability on R&D, I can potentially then run server 4 and they won't be able to protect whatever's in server 4. So as a result, I access and steal an Obo Carter, which I happily steal, dropping 4 cards, but one of them's an I've Had Worse, so I'm back to a healthy level. I Dirty Laundry again, run Last Click, potentially dangerous, but with an MK Ultra in the bin, I'm feeling slightly safer about this play, and I see a Surveyor. So now we kind of get an idea of what kind of deck my opponent's running. A Glacier style deck that attempts to stack a bunch of ice on the remote, clicklessly with Mti's ability, and creditlessly, making Surveyors very powerful, very potent. Unfortunately for my opponent, I have drawn into the cards I need. 2 Employee Strikes should see me through the rest of this entire game. So as they attempt to score an agenda here, I can feel happy about the strikes, basically suppressing my opponent's ability to defend this remote. But since R&D is open, why not attack R&D first before sieging the remote? After all, the remote run's not guaranteed if they have a code gate that ends the run on server 4, most likely a Thimble Lyric, I won't be able to get through. I still haven't found the Black Orchestra despite having dug through 2/3 of my deck. 45 cards, 14 left in stack, of which 2 are Black Orchestras. I could play the Inject to find the Black Orchestra here, but instead I decided to strike, run R&D, see a Nisei Mark II bringing me to match point. Okay, they're running Nisei Mark II, the remote probably is a Nisei Mark II, let's go for it. I'm going to run the remote here, and because of my earlier setup with the Data Sucker, I'm able to break Surveyor very cheaply. Data Sucker counter is really helping. Also, with breaking this Anansi, I break it for 6 as opposed to the standard 9 credits. And indeed, that was the winning Nisei Mark II for me. A very handily won game, despite not seeing Employee Strike up till the final turn. Actions do speak louder than words, don't they? I did mention in my MT Wenkundu successful demo video that you need to run early and often versus MT. Well, this game is proof of what you can achieve if you are not afraid of MT's potential power. By running aggressively, this game I was able to basically, completely shut down my opponent. My opponent couldn't get the remote upgrade going, the Daruma, which would have, defended the Nisei Mark II in the remote that I won the game off. I also was able to trash a Rashida on the table because they installed it naked, thinking that they could scare me into not running it because they would empty Wenkundu, but they were wrong. I am very aggressive. I am Khumalo. And also, by running R&D so much, those single accesses add up. I did manage to steal 5 points of R&D, which was the reason I was able to win in such a dominating fashion. As it turns out, the best hard counter against Mti Wenkundu isn't Employee Strike. It's your basic action card. A lot of people just don't think of the power that making a run can do, can provide. And this game is just complete proof that sometimes they just don't have it. Sure, I misplayed on that turn where I could have gotten flatlined by a timely Cortex Lock, but again, not every empty deck has Cortex Lock, and even if they run 3 copies of it, they won't necessarily see it every single game, in every single opening hand. So, by fretting over the worst case scenarios, you're only just inhibiting yourself from achieving great things. Even if my opponent had some bulkier ice that I couldn't deal with, throughout the game, I had no solutions to DNA Tracker. That one wimpy Thimbleric was able to stop me dead in my tracks from accessing HQ, let alone a giant nasty DNA Tracker. But realistically, would that have been a big deal? If they inflicted a DNA Tracker on me, sure, I would have lost a couple of cards from my hand, lose a bit of tempo, but what do they give up? They become so poor, they won't have the money to play IPOs or even hedge funds, and best of all, R&D was exposed the entire game. If they put a DNA Tracker to stop me from trashing the Rashida, well, I just run their R&D and steal agendas anyway. So really, don't be afraid of those big eyes, because they most likely hurt Mti Wenkundu more than it hurts you. They are not an economy ID, they cannot afford to keep rezzing Shiyashis in your face. It also helps that I was playing Anarch. It turns out that the Anarch faction is more suited to counter Mti Wenkundu than most others, simply because they have so many cards in faction that just don't really care about Mti's ability. I've had worse, I drew a lot of I've had worses in the early game, and those really help. It gave me the golden ticket to run centrals and run more often, because I knew that I could easily absorb those net damage and still come out ahead in the tempo game. Clan Vengeance would have been another great counter, but obviously I'm not running 0 in this deck, so I'm not running Clan Vengeance. But if you do, all power to you. It's a very hard counter to Mti Wenkundu because you can empty their hand, empty Mti's hand. That's the saying. And unlike Shapers or Criminals, you don't have to worry about your breakers going in the bin, because that's exactly where you want your breakers to be. If you're Shaper or Criminal or Mini Faction, you would probably have to install your breakers every time you draw them, otherwise you won't be able to run. But as Anarch, Hail Mary, man. That's all you need to do. So yeah, if you need any more reasons why Mti Wenkundu should be played aggressively against, I asked my opponent at the end of the game, what did you have in your HQ? 5 cards there. Turned out they were agenda flooded. They had Obo Carter, they had Philotic, and the only ice they had to really threaten me was the Surveyor, which, while pretty taxing, make no mistake. If they had managed to get the Surveyor on the remote, I wouldn't have been able to get the Nisei shot of a stim hack run, so Employee Strike helped there. But it wasn't a painful piece of ice. It wasn't anything that you should be really overly concerned about. If anything, the thing I should have been concerned about were the 2 snares in my opponent's freaking hand. That could have easily killed me. It's quite ironic. It ended up that the Thimble Lyric that my opponent played on HQ actually helped me more than hindered me, because, you know, I would have hammered HQ otherwise and I would have hit those bloody snares. So there you go. MT Kundu. You know, they're playing MT like they're playing poker. They think, you know, it's as though they have pocket aces in every single hand, but guess what? Most of the time they don't. Just run. Just do it. Just run and make those runs count, because oftentimes they don't have it and they can't stop you from trashing the board state. Right, so now let's look at Patchwork. Patchwork was a pretty decent card this game. It didn't achieve very much, but I attribute that mostly to the game ending very quickly. I managed to get 4 triggers off Patchwork this game. When you negate the 4 install cost, that means that it netted me as much money as a sure gamble. Nothing to write home about, but again, if I hadn't stolen 5 points off of R&D that early on, the game would have gone on and Patchwork would have started ticking up. It would have made 6 credits, 8 credits, 10 credits, you know, and it all adds up, and by the time I found my Black Orchestra, I would have needed the extra memory that Patchwork provides. So very, very useful card. Sometimes it does force you to discard useful cards. I wasn't able to showcase Divide and Conquer this game. Well, I did. I showcased it as a form of Patchwork fodder. But yeah, we don't get to talk about this new Rain and Reverie card this video simply because I didn't play it. So that's the downside there. It is a notable downside, right? It's not like the banned console Cipher, where you don't really have to care about the -1 hand size downside at all. That is hardly a downside. The downside to Patchwork is real. Trashing card from your hand is not something you want to do most of the time, but it's something that you can afford to do every now and then, and the payoff is really awesome. 2 credits discount, nothing to scoff at. One more thing I want to talk about Patchwork. I think some of you may have noticed that towards the end, on the very last turn, there was a possible Patchwork trigger for me when I installed the MK Ultra from my bin when I was contesting the winning Nisei. Against the Surveyor, I installed MK Ultra from the bin, and that could potentially be a Patchwork trigger. I completely forgot that Patchwork could trigger here. In hindsight, it didn't really matter, because had I remembered it, I would not have triggered Patchwork anyway. Reason being that I was sufficiently rich, but more importantly, because by using Patchwork here, I would have to trash a card from my hand, and while I did have fodder in the form of the duplicate Patchwork in my hand, I would have gone down to 4 cards. If the innermost ice on the remote server was a Kakugo, I would have gone down to 3 cards after taking the net damage, and if the inner agenda is an Obokata, I would not have been able to steal it for the game. So these are things you always have to keep in mind. Patchwork puts you further away from stealing Obokatas. That is kind of a downside that you have to play around when you're in the Jinteki matchup. But yeah, it's still very interesting. Brings home the point that Patchwork is a clickless ability and has a lot of possible triggers every single turn. Almost every turn, in fact, there will be a chance of some sort to play Patchwork, because, or rather trigger Patchwork, because you're either installing cards from hand or playing events from hand. Patchwork can trigger off events as well. We played a sure gamble this game for 3 credits. You know, it even triggers off MK Ultra installs from the bin as well. So lots of ways to trigger Patchwork. It's a very reliable card for gaining money. That's not something you should overlook. Hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you've learned how to play against MT Kundu, because I was very satisfied with the way I played this game. Thanks for watching. Happy net running. Goodbye.